She walked into the first-class cabin with an old fabric backpack and a plain sweater surrounded by designer bags, silk dresses, and tailored suits. An influencer filmed and whispered, "Fashion disaster in the wrong cabin." Another passenger laughed out loud and said, "Must be a ticketing mistake." This is first class, not for backpackers. They had no idea the woman they were mocking was married to the billionaire who owns the entire airline. Her name was Emily Carter, and she was 30 years old. She stood there quiet, her soft blue sweater slightly wrinkled from the long morning she'd had. Her sneakers were clean but worn, and her low ponytail swayed just a bit as she moved toward her seat. She didn't look at the people staring. She didn't flinch at the whispers. She just adjusted the straps of her backpack and kept her eyes on the boarding pass in her hand. The cabin smelled like leather and expensive perfume, and the hum of the plane's engines was barely noticeable over the chatter of the passengers, rich, loud, and full of themselves. Emily didn't belong here, not in their eyes. And they made sure she knew it. Before she even sat down, a woman in a red silk dress, her hair piled high with perfect curls, leaned over to her friend and said, "Did she walk into the wrong cabin?" First class doesn't allow fashion disasters. Her voice wasn't quiet. It carried sharp and deliberate, like she wanted Emily to hear. A man in a tailored suit, his cufflinks glinting under the cabin lights, chuckled from across the aisle. "Backpack in first class." "That's a first," he said, loud enough for the whole section to turn and look. Emily didn't react. She slid her backpack under the seat and pulled out a worn paperback book, its corners bent from being read too many times. She opened it and started reading, her face calm, like she hadn't heard a word. The flight attendant approached a young woman with a tight smile and a name tag that said Claire. She leaned down and said, "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Her tone was polite, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes, like she was trying to figure out how someone like Emily ended up here. The passengers nearby went quiet, waiting for the mistake to be confirmed. Emily looked up, her brown eyes steady, and handed over her boarding pass. Claire scanned it, and her face changed. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice softer now. "You're in the right place. Priority status. Welcome aboard." She gave a small bow and walked away, leaving the cabin in a ripple of awkward silence. The woman in the red dress rolled her eyes and whispered something to her friend. The man in the suit just smirked and went back to his phone. As Claire moved down the aisle, a woman in a tailored blazer, her nails painted a glossy red, stood up and blocked her path. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and loud enough for the whole cabin to hear, "but how does someone like her get priority status? I've been flying first class for years, and I've never seen anything so out of place." She gestured toward Emily, her diamond bracelet catching the light. The cabin buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Emily's fingers tightened slightly on her book, but she didn't look up. Claire hesitated, then said, "Her boarding pass is valid, ma'am." "She's where she's supposed to be." The woman scoffed, tossing her hair. "Valid. That's not the point. This is about standards." She sat down, but not before giving Emily a look that could have cut glass. Emily turned a page, her face still, but her knuckles were pale against the book's cover. "Hey, before we go any further, can you do me a quick favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to keep sharing stories like this, stories about real people, real moments, and real heart. Just takes a second and it helps more than you know. All right, let's keep going." Emily settled into her seat, her book open on her lap. The cabin was buzzing again, but now the whispers were sharper, more pointed. A group of influencers, 3 women in their early 20s, sat a few rows ahead. They were dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine, matching athleisure sets, gold jewelry, and glossy lips. One of them, a blonde with a phone always in her hand, turned around and started filming. "Okay, guys," she said to her camera, "we're in first class, living the dream, but, what is this?" She tilted the phone toward Emily, catching her in the frame. "First class, but looking like Walmart," she said, and her friends burst out laughing. The blonde kept filming, zooming in on Emily's sneakers, her backpack, her plain sweater. Emily didn't look up. She turned a page in her book, her hands steady, like she was alone in the world. The man next to her, a businessman with slicked back hair and a Rolex that caught the light every time he moved, leaned over. "You know," he said, his voice dripping with fake kindness, "if you're lost, the economy section is that way." He pointed toward the back of the plane, and a few people nearby snickered. Emily glanced at him just for a second, her eyes meeting his. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. It wasn't loud, wasn't angry. But it was enough to make him pause, like he hadn't expected her to answer at all. He cleared his throat and went back to his laptop, his fingers tapping a little too hard on the keys. Then from the galley, Robert, the chief flight attendant, stepped out. He walked straight to Emily and handed her a small leather folder. "Mrs. Carter," he said loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "The captain asked me to personally deliver this. It's the flight manifest with your name listed as a distinguished guest." The businessman's fingers froze on his keyboard. The influencer's laughter died. Emily nodded, took the folder and set it beside her book without opening it. The plane took off and the cabin settled into a hum of activity. People sipped champagne, scrolled through their phones, and traded stories about their latest deals or vacations. Emily stayed quiet, her book still open, but her eyes flicked up now and then, taking in the room. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't hiding. She was just there. And that seemed to bother people even more. An older woman, her pearls gleaming against a black cashmere sweater, leaned toward the flight attendant and said, "I'd like a different seat. I don't feel comfortable next to someone who doesn't follow the dress code." She didn't lower her voice. Everyone heard it. The attendant, Claire, hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do, ma'am," she said. But her eyes darted to Emily like she was trying to figure out what was going on. A man in a navy blazer, his tie loosened, overheard and chimed in. "Honestly, it's a disgrace," he said, his voice booming. "I paid thousands for this seat and now I'm stuck looking at that." He waved a hand toward Emily's backpack, his face red with indignation. Emily's jaw tightened just for a moment, but she kept reading, her eyes fixed on the page. The cruelty didn't stop. A woman in a sequined top, her earrings dangling like chandeliers, decided to take it further. She stood up, walked to Emily's seat, and dropped a crumpled napkin onto her lap. "Here," she said, her voice loud and mocking. "You missed a spot from that juice spill earlier. Thought I'd help." The cabin erupted in laughter, harsh and unrelenting. The influencers whipped out their phones again, filming the napkin, filming Emily, their giggles like knives. Emily picked up the napkin, folded it neatly, and set it on her tray. She didn't say a word. But her hands moved with a precision that felt like a warning. The woman in the sequined top smirked and sauntered back to her seat, high-fiving one of the rich kids as she passed. Claire, the flight attendant, watched from the aisle, her face tight with discomfort, but she didn't intervene. Emily's shoulders stayed straight, but her fingers lingered on the napkin, pressing it flat like she was holding herself together. Then something shifted. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, traveling with her mother in first class, slipped out of her seat and walked to Emily. She was small, with braids and a shy smile, clutching a sketchbook. "I drew this for you," she said, her voice barely audible over the cabin's hum. She handed Emily a pencil drawing of a woman in a sweater standing tall with a quiet strength in her eyes. "I think you're nice," the girl added, then darted back to her seat. The cabin went quiet, the laughter fading. The woman in the sequined top rolled her eyes, but the businessman next to Emily shifted uncomfortably. Emily looked at the drawing, her lips curving into a small, real smile. She tucked it into her book, her fingers gentle, and mouthed a silent thank you to the girl. The moment passed, but it lingered like a crack in the cabin's cruelty. Emily didn't say anything. She closed her book and reached for her orange juice, the glass cool in her hand. But as she lifted it, her elbow brushed the armrest, and the juice spilled, splashing onto her sweater and the seat. The businessman next to her scoffed. "You belong in economy," he said, his voice loud now, like he was performing for the cabin. "First class isn't for everyone." The influencers turned around again, their phones out, recording the whole thing. "Oh my God," the blonde said, laughing. "This is too good." Emily didn't flinch. She pulled a napkin from her tray and started wiping the mess, her movements slow and deliberate. "I'm sorry," she said softly to no one in particular. The chief flight attendant, Robert, appeared from the galley. He watched her for a moment, then handed her another napkin. "No trouble at all, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice warm. "Let me help." He didn't look at the other passengers, but his tone carried a weight that made them go quiet. The flight went on, and the tension in the cabin didn't fade. It grew. The influencers kept whispering, their phones always ready. The woman in the red dress made a show of spraying perfume, like Emily's presence was somehow offensive. The rich kids, a group of guys in their early 20s with designer sneakers and loud voices, started getting bolder. One of them, a tall guy with a backwards baseball cap, tossed his bag onto the seat next to Emily's. It was too close, crowding her space, but she didn't say anything. She just shifted slightly, making room. Then as he reached for his drink, he accidentally knocked a cup of water onto her sweater. It soaked through, leaving a dark stain. "Oops," he said, grinning. "Good thing it's easy to wash." His friends laughed loud and cruel, their voices bouncing off the cabin walls. Emily looked at him, her face still calm, but her eyes held his for a moment longer than before. "Careful," she said, her voice low. Just one word. It wasn't a threat, wasn't loud. But it stopped him. He blinked, then turned away, his grin fading. But the rich kids weren't done. The one with the baseball cap. Ethan leaned over again, this time holding a cheap plastic pen he'd pulled from his bag. "Hey," he said loud enough for the whole cabin to hear, "you look like you could use this. For like your grocery list or whatever, people like you do." He tossed the pen onto Emily's tray, where it landed with a clatter. His friends howled with laughter, one of them slapping the armrest like it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. The woman with the pearls smirked, her eyes gleaming with approval. Emily picked up the pen, turned it over in her hand, and set it back on his tray without a word. Her face didn't change, but the way she placed it, slow, deliberate, made the laughter falter. Ethan's face reddened, and he snatched the pen back, muttering something under his breath. The cabin watched, waiting for her to crack, but she didn't. She just opened her book again like nothing had happened. Then came an unexpected pause. The plane's intercom crackled, and a voice from the cockpit broke through. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're proud to have a special guest on board today, a member of our airline's founding family. Please join me in acknowledging her presence." The cabin froze. Every head turned to Emily. The influencers' phones dropped to their laps. The businessman's jaw tightened. Emily didn't move, didn't acknowledge the announcement. She just turned a page in her book, her face calm, but her eyes flicked to the window where the clouds stretched endless and white. Robert, the chief flight attendant, stepped into the aisle and nodded toward her, a small gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed. The woman in the red dress gripped her armrest, her face pale. The cabin stayed silent, the weight of the captain's words sinking in. The businessman leaned over again, his voice sharp now. "Next time, screen ticket holders better," he said to the flight attendant, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're paying for an experience, not awkward encounters." The woman with the pearls nodded, her lips tight. "Exactly," she said. "This is unacceptable." The cabin felt colder now, like the air itself had turned against Emily. People weren't just whispering, they were staring, judging, waiting for her to break. But she didn't. She folded her napkin, set it on her tray, and opened her book again. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She was a rock in a storm, and that only made them angrier. The cruelty took a darker turn during the beverage service. A man in a linen suit, his sunglasses perched on his head like a crown, decided to make a spectacle. He stood up holding his champagne glass and addressed the cabin like he was giving a toast. "To first class," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Where apparently anyone can waltz in with a backpack and ruin the vibe." He turned to Emily, raising his glass in a mock salute. "Cheers to you, sweetheart. Hope you're enjoying our seats." The cabin laughed, but it was a mean, jagged sound. Emily didn't look at him. She reached for her water, her movements slow, and took a sip. But her hand paused just for a second, and the glass trembled slightly. The man noticed and grinned, leaning closer. "What's wrong? Feeling out of place yet?" Emily set the glass down, her eyes meeting his. "Not at all," she said, her voice steady. The man's grin faltered, and he sat down, his champagne untouched. The chief flight attendant, Robert, watched from the galley. He'd been on this airline for 20 years, seen every kind of passenger, rich, rude, entitled kind. He knew the ones who mattered, the ones who didn't need to shout to be heard. And he was watching Emily. Not because she was loud or flashy, but because she wasn't. He'd seen her boarding pass. He'd seen the priority status, the name. He didn't say anything, but he kept his eyes on her like he was waiting for something. Then as he passed her seat, he leaned down and placed a small pin on her tray, a gold emblem of the airline's logo given only to VIPs. "This is yours, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice clear. "It's been in our records for years." The cabin went quiet again. The man in the linen suit choked on his drink. The influencers exchanged nervous glances. Emily touched the pin, her fingers light, and nodded. She didn't pin it on. She just slipped it into her pocket like it was nothing. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and the cabin went quiet for a moment. Emily looked out the window, her face soft like she was remembering something. Years ago, she'd been on a flight like this, not first class, just a cramped economy seat, her knees pressed against the seat in front of her. She'd been 18, heading to college her whole life, packed into a bag just like the one under her seat now. Her parents had been strict, their wealth a weight she carried but never showed. They'd taught her to move through the world quietly, to let her actions speak. She'd learned it well. Too well, maybe. People always misread her. They saw the plain clothes, the lack of flash, and they assumed she was less. She let them. It was easier that way. But sometimes, like now, it stung. The turbulence passed and the cabin came back to life. The influencers were at it again, their voices louder now, like they were trying to outdo each other. "I bet she's a teacher or something," the blonde said, her phone still out. "Like, no offense, but first class is for people who've made it." Her friend, a brunette with a fake tan, laughed. "Yeah, like go grade papers in the back." They didn't care who heard them. They wanted to be heard. Emily didn't look up, but her fingers paused on the page just for a second. The businessman next to her muttered something under his breath, too quiet to catch, but his smirk said enough. The attacks grew personal. A woman in a velvet jacket, her hair streaked with platinum, leaned across the aisle and spoke directly to Emily for the first time. "Honey," she said, her voice sweet but venomous, "you're making everyone here uncomfortable. Why don't you just switch seats? Save us all the trouble." She smiled, but it was a smile that cut. The cabin watched, waiting for Emily's response. Emily closed her book, her movements slow, and looked at the woman. "I'm comfortable where I am," she said, her voice calm but firm. The woman's smile froze. She opened her mouth to say something, then stopped. Emily held her gaze for a moment longer, then went back to her book. The woman sat back, her face flushed, and the cabin buzzed with tension. The rich kid, Ethan, snorted. "She's got guts. I'll give her that," he said, but his voice was uneasy now, like he wasn't sure who he was mocking anymore. Then came a moment no one expected. A flight attendant, not Claire, but an older woman named Susan, approached Emily with a tray of champagne flutes. "Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice warm and deliberate, "the crew wanted to offer you this on behalf of the airline. It's our signature vintage reserved for our most valued passengers." She placed the flute on Emily's tray, her hands steady, and gave a small nod. The cabin was silent, every eye on the glass. The woman in the velvet jacket stared, her mouth slightly open. The influencers' phones were still, their faces pale. Emily looked at the champagne, then at Susan. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. She didn't drink it. She just set it aside, her fingers brushing the stem, and went back to her book. Susan smiled and walked away, but not before shooting a glance at the other passengers, a look that said more than words could. Then came the meal service, and things got worse. The flight attendants rolled out carts with linen napkins and silver cutlery, the kind of thing that made first class feel like a restaurant in the sky. Emily ordered a simple salad, nothing fancy, and ate quietly, her movements careful. The woman in the red dress watched her, her eyes narrow. "Some people don't know how to act in a place like this," she said to her friend, loud enough for Emily to hear. "It's embarrassing." The rich kid with the baseball cap leaned over and added, "Yeah, like maybe take a class on class." His friends laughed again, their voices sharp, cutting through the hum of the plane. Emily set her fork down, her face still calm, but her eyes flicked to the kid for just a moment. "Maybe you should," she said, her voice soft but steady. The cabin went quiet. The kid blinked, his grin gone. He didn't say anything else. The meal service ended and the cabin settled into a tense hum. People were still watching Emily, but now there was something else in the air, curiosity maybe. Or unease. The chief flight attendant, Robert, appeared again, this time with a small tray of hot towels. He handed one to Emily first before anyone else. "For you, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice warm but professional. The businessman next to her frowned, like he was trying to figure out why she was getting special treatment. The woman with the pearls leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Mrs. Carter," she said almost to herself. It was the first time anyone had said Emily's name out loud, and it hung in the air heavy, like a clue no one could quite place. The plane was starting its descent, now the seatbelt sign glowing overhead. The influencers were still at it, but their voices were quieter, like they sensed something was off. The blonde put her phone down for the first time, her eyes flicking to Emily. The businessman closed his laptop, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. The woman in the red dress adjusted her scarf, her movements quick, like she was trying to distract herself. Emily didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't show it. She closed her book and slipped it into her backpack, her hands steady, her face calm. but there was something in the way she moved, something that said she was ready for whatever came next. The final blow came just before landing. A man in a pinstripe suit, his voice polished and commanding, stood up and addressed the flight attendants. "I'm speaking for all of us," he said, his eyes locked on Emily. "This woman is a distraction. Her presence is lowering the entire experience. I demand she be moved to economy immediately." The cabin murmured in agreement, a chorus of nods and whispered yeses. The woman with the pearls clapped softly like it was a performance. Emily didn't move, but her hands stilled on her backpack, her fingers curling slightly. Claire, the flight attendant, opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Robert stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice calm but firm, "Mrs. Carter is exactly where she belongs." Her seat was personally reserved by the airline's chairman. The man in the pinstripe suit froze, his face paling. The cabin went silent, the murmurs dying instantly. Emily adjusted her backpack, her movements slow, and looked out the window, her face unreadable. Then the PA system chimed and a voice came through, clear and calm. "Would the airline chairman and his wife please make their way to the cockpit for crew briefing?" The words hit the cabin like a shockwave. Faces turned. Mouths opened. The influencers froze their phones, forgotten. The businessman's head snapped up, his eyes wide. The woman with the pearls clutched her armrest, her face pale. Emily didn't move at first. She just sat there, her backpack on her lap, her eyes on the seat in front of her. Then from the main cabin a man appeared. He was tall, elegant, his suit perfectly tailored but not flashy. His hair was dark with a touch of gray, and his face was calm, like he'd seen everything and wasn't surprised by any of it. He walked straight to Emily's seat, his step steady, his presence filling the cabin. He leaned down and placed a jacket on her shoulders, his hands gentle. "Thanks for waiting, my love," he said, his voice low but clear. "The crew's ready for our final briefing." The cabin went silent. Not a whisper, not a cough. Just the hum of the plane and the weight of every eye on Emily. Her name was Emily Carter, and the man was David Carter, billionaire CEO of the airline. The truth landed like a bomb. The influencers dropped their phones, their faces white. The businessman lowered his head, his hands clenched in his lap. The woman in the red dress stared at her lap, her scarf twisted in her fingers. The rich kid with the baseball cap looked like he wanted to disappear. The chief flight attendant, Robert, stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice steady. "Mr. Carter, right this way." Emily stood up, her movements slow, deliberate. She adjusted the jacket on her shoulders and picked up her backpack. She didn't look at the passengers, didn't acknowledge their stares. But as she turned to follow David, she paused just for a moment. She looked back at the cabin, her eyes sweeping over the faces that had mocked her. "Your seat doesn't define your worth," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The way you treat people does." Then she turned and walked toward the cockpit, her head high, her steps steady. The plane landed, and the fallout began. The names of the passengers who'd mocked Emily were flagged in the airline system. No more priority boarding. No more upgrades. The influencers' video, the one they'd been so proud of, was pulled from their social media after it went viral for all the wrong reasons. Comments flooded in, calling them out for their cruelty. The businessman, a hedge fund manager named Richard Holt, got a call from his firm the next day. His behavior had been reported and he was out of a job. The woman in the red dress, a socialite named Margaret Ellison, found herself uninvited from the next big gala. Her name was whispered now, but not in the way she wanted. The rich kid with the baseball cap, a trust fund heir named Ethan Brooks, lost his sponsorship deal with a sneaker brand. His friends stopped answering his texts. Emily didn't see any of this. She didn't need to. She and David walked off the plane together, their hands brushing as they moved through the terminal. The crew lined up to thank them, their faces warm, their respect clear. Emily smiled, just a small one, and nodded. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. The truth was out there now, and it spoke for itself. A few weeks later, the airline announced a new initiative, Kindness in the Sky. It was Emily's idea, born from that flight, from the way people had treated her. It wasn't about revenge, it was about change. Training programs for staff, new policies for passengers, a focus on respect over status. Emily became the face of it, not because she wanted the spotlight, but because she wanted people to understand. She stood at a press conference, her plain sweater and sneakers unchanged, and spoke about dignity, about how it doesn't come from money or clothes or a first-class seat. The cameras flashed, but she didn't flinch. She just kept talking, her voice steady, her words real. The story spread. People talked about it on social media, in coffee shops, at dinner tables. They talked about the woman who'd walked into first class with nothing but a backpack and a book, who'd taken every insult and come out stronger. They talked about the passengers who'd judged her, who'd learned the hard way that worth isn't what you wear. And they talked about Emily, who didn't need to shout or fight or prove anything. She just was. It wasn't about the money, though. The money was there. It wasn't about the power, though. The power was real. It was about the way she carried herself, the way she looked at the world and said, without a word, I'm enough. And for everyone who'd ever been looked down on, who'd ever been told they didn't belong, that moment felt like a quiet victory. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just true. You know what it's like to be judged. To walk into a room and feel every eye on you, picking you apart. To stay quiet. Not because you're weak, but because you know your worth doesn't need their approval. Emily's story isn't just hers, it's yours too. You've been there. You've felt it. And you're still here. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.